BNC, 100% black and brown host around the clock. Finally, news that speaks to us.
We head now to Chicago to preview what could be the final chapter in the Jussie Smollett hate crime hoax saga. The former Empire star is expected to be in court tomorrow for sentencing. He was convicted in December on disorderly conduct charges for lying to police about an assault they say he staged for publicity. Let's bring in my panel of legal experts, criminal defense attorneys Lauren Prater and Phil Hamilton. Thank you both for coming on tonight. Let's just start with the charges that Jussie was convicted of and the possible sentences. He was found guilty on 5 counts of lying to a police officer and detectives about being a hate crime and battery victim. He was found not guilty on a 6th count. Now, convictions for these Class 4 felony charges come with a range of sentences, but Smollett could get up to 3 years in prison for each count. But given this is his first criminal conviction, Lauren, what do you expect Smollett's sentence will be?
I think that based upon the fact that it is his first criminal conviction, he can expect to see some sort of leniency. Typically, when judges go into sentencing, they have to consider a variety of factors, including criminal history, whether or not the offender or the defendant has a likeliness to reoffend. They will look at their ties to the community, how they've been, if they've, how they've maintained jobs, and what they've been able to contribute to society throughout their life. And Jussie Smollett is going to have a lot of that bidding in his favor. The defense is going to call on, I think I've heard various people were going to come out, including Samuel L. Jackson wrote a letter, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, he wrote a letter. I'm tongue-tied over here. And his 92-year-old grandmother is going to write a letter. So I don't anticipate that he is going to do the 3 years that is affiliated with each count. I mean, we have 5 counts, 3 years max each. So we could be looking at 15 years if everything is ran consecutively. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think that the defense is going to argue strongly for, if any type of imprisonment, a small sentence, 6 months, if anything, but probably more so probation or some sort of community control.
Phil, one factor that could weigh against leniency was Jussie's own testimony at trial, right? The special prosecutor told reporters after the verdict that he lied under oath for hours and hours and hours, something that the judge could take into consideration when deciding what punishment he deserves. What do you think that will do, or do you think that that will weigh or have an effect on what he's sentenced to tomorrow?
I think to the extent that he is sentenced potentially a little bit more than otherwise he would be, let's say that he does end up having to do somewhere between 3 to 6 months in jail. I think most people convicted of these kinds of charges coming with the lack of criminal history that he has, of course, he can be expected most likely to not do any jail time at all. But to the extent that he does, it most likely will be because of that testimony on the stand, which in many respects, the jury outright found not credible when they ultimately convicted him on these 5 counts. Moreover, I am, personally just wondering how a lot of the papers that have been filed post-verdict from his defense team in regards to essentially still asserting his innocence, essentially, blaming the judge in certain respects for misconduct throughout the course of the trial that led to the verdict that was against Jussie. I wonder how ultimately that politically plays into whatever calculation the judge might be making about a sentence. So, I think ultimately it could have an effect. I think, nevertheless, it is unlikely that he spends any time in jail. But could it potentially up what otherwise he would have received but for that testimony? Sure.
Lauren, before handing down a sentence, the judge still has to rule on the defense's request for a new trial, and some of the reasons are actually aimed at the judge himself, what they claimed he did to jeopardize or bias the defense in front of the jury, which is kind of awkward, right? You're asking the judge to rule in your favor, but you're also claiming that the judge acted inappropriately. What are the chances of them actually getting a new trial?
Motions for new trial are filed commonly and granted extremely rarely. In this situation, again, like you said, it's awkward to say the least that you have a motion that is harping on all of the inadequacies of the judge, and you're asking the judge basically to say, yes, I did not do this correctly. Yes, I did abuse my discretion. And yes, you are going to get granted a new trial. That is extremely unlikely, especially in a high profile case like this. I don't think the judge is going to ruin his own credibility like that. Again, these motions are filed extremely routinely. There were a ton of different facts that were brought up in the motion, including the judge's inability to let the defense ask questions during jury selection, the judge's inability to consider the defense's input when asking questions. I mean, they tore this judge apart. I do not think that the judge is going to take lightly to that. And it's a very fine line that we have to play as defense attorneys, as when we're advocating for our client, when at the same time you don't want to completely infuriate the person that is going to essentially control your client's fate. So to answer your question and to circle back, I do not think that this motion is going to be granted. I think that they will move forward with sentencing, and I hope that the judge does not let that play on his overall sentence that he decides to hand out to Mr. Smollett.
Phil, Chicago police wants the judge tomorrow to order Smollett to pay around $130,000 in restitution. This is the same amount from the lawsuit the city filed against Jussie to cover expenses that the police department spent on overtime investigating this case. Now, that lawsuit was put on hold until after sentencing. Do you think the judge is likely to approve this request for restitution?
I don't think the judge is likely to approve it. I mean, the thing typically when you're dealing with the city civilly trying to recoup that money is that there's going to be a showing via affidavits, via economic testimony to the exact dime, dollar, and penny that was ultimately spent with respect to overtime and the investigation of a case that, as it turns out, the jury found was not a credible case to begin with. And so I think in that respect, will the judge ultimately grant $130,000 plus in restitution? I think it's unlikely. Of course, the judge actually has the discretion to do so. Whether or not he will, it really depends, I think, also a lot on what Jussie is going to say tomorrow during his comments. Of course, all the letters and what have you have been considered. But whatever Jussie says, is that going to be enough to potentially just leave the judge to say, you know what, I'm going to leave this for civil court. The city can spend the money litigating it there to get the money. I'm not ultimately going to grant this. But again, to the extent that, something tomorrow goes awry as far as the judge is concerned, with Jussie refusing to accept responsibility, or if it already has just been thought through that this is appropriate, then of course he could get hit with that bill tomorrow.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing Jussie speak to the court. I think it would be very interesting because, up until this point, he hasn't apologized for doing anything wrong at all. So definitely going to be watching that sentencing hearing tomorrow, which is open to the public. So we'll definitely be circling back on that. Attorneys Phil Hamilton and Lauren Prater, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Appreciate both.